I'm very happy to be here in this session organized by our distinguished colleague Mila, and I'm very proud that she has written a few sentences here that I think are very important for the purpose of this work. We have to see the voices that currently dominate the discussion tend to be from regions located mainly in the global north, where there are well-resourced institutions of higher learning and relatively easy access to publications outlets. Fresh voices tend to come exactly from such peripheral places and geopolitical and social cultural interests. In anticipation, she asks us, whose futures? Who decides on the most appropriate futures? What kind of individual does it to carry out comprehensive social cultural transformation? These are the questions. So I'm sure the speakers will address the issues. He is going to speak, bring forth futures, anticipation for culture making and world building in the 21st century.
I am Mila Popovich, as our president announced me. By the way, the chair of the session is Heitor Gurgulino de Sousa, who is the current president of the World Academy of Art and Science, and it is a great honor to have him here from Brazil. I am nominally an associate fellow of the World Academy, where I am the chair of the Membership Communications Committee. I'm also retained as a project manager on a very important initiative called New Economic Theory. I am a fellow of the Vital Voices, which is a global women's leadership network. I'm also an associate expert at the European Commission, but other than that, I'm a mom of two extraordinary human beings. I'm also an artistic director, performing artist, and a bilingual poet. I will be drawing on these other experiences exactly in the spirit of the theme of the session. And the session was convened Marx Willing of Stellenbosch University, as we shared many affinities coming from, I was born in Montenegro, currently residing in the US, and he's coming from South Africa. So our interests are coming from there, and this is why I would like to share a little bit about the concept. There is a wide and growing consensus that we're going through what many refers to as the Great Transformation, from an epoch based on exploitation of nature for the benefit of few, to an epoch that can hopefully be more sustainable and just. World history is so on the cusp of another great transformation, as we can witness in such established writings and reports from, say, German Advisory Council on Global Change from 2011, Global Commission on Economy and Climate from 2014, or say 2011 report of United Nations, as well as the launch of the Future Earth Initiative at the Rio +20 conference in 2012 by the world's mainstream natural and social science association, was in recognition of the need for the scientific community to better understand and prepare for this process of global change. So unsurprisingly, this has given rise to a massive growth of a wide range of methodologies for anticipating the future in one way or another. So anticipation actually lies then at the heart of urgent contemporary debates, from economic crisis to the rise of the global south to climate change. So as the past becomes less useful to anticipating the future, a wide range of anticipatory practices have started to emerge that are suggestive of an unfolding future and guide the futures that actor networks start to imagine and realize or materialize. Discovering and realizing the evolutionary potential of key practices in the present should, in theory, be the focus of this paper and this research. These practices are, however, emerging across all cultures in all the regions of the world, as the impacts of the global multifaceted crises are experienced in context-specific ways. However, it is not this reality of a diversity of voices that gets reflected in the grand narratives of transformation generated by mainstream institutions such as those cited above. So, in other words, while we have mainstream formation of this discipline, as well as modes of anticipation, as well as then consequently modes of realizing a vision of future, many voices get excluded. And the idea was exactly to bring together diversity of voices from different regions, some of them unincorporated regions or unincorporated walks of life, and perspectives into a gathering which should basically reflect back on this very conference. Who is it that had the money to come to this conference and participate in this discussion and then consequently become the part of forming of a discipline as it nascent? So you heard me at the very plenary pose the question, what happens when we introduce or embed a new nascent discipline into old power structures? And that's the question that I'll just leave for us to ponder. So a series of questions are emerging about who is it that gets to anticipate, whose futures get to be represented, ultimately what kind of overall reality are we going to inhabit. Central to this discussion is then narrative and narrativization. Whose stories get to be heard, and whose story do we get to tell, and what is the story that is going to define our future, our mental frameworks, our worldview, that is the metaphors by which we live, to use Joanna Macy's phrase. So these are the stories that we tell ourselves and ways we make sense of ourselves, of another, and the world, and also the ways we build cultures and the world. So this big dramatic title that I put in the paper ultimately boils down to every single one of us as participants and co-creators in the culture. We are creatures of culture and nature. We have always been prosthetic beings, because through our mind, through our consciousness, we extend beyond what is biologically given, right? So we are the culture makers that decide how we build our worlds, and we are deciding, apparently the question we're asking is, now, what are the decisions that we're making? Now, what kind of human beings are we being in order to create a more just and more what I called wholesome future? Social cultural trends and terms for their understanding of these two modalities of future generating. The first one I called strong futuring, more immediate, more observable and predictable. It depends on technological means of accessibility, accumulation, and analysis of data that allow for projection and forecasting and for trend setting. Its presence is strong. We tend to feel strongly about our projections and forecasts as they're based on registered factors and methodologies available. Next to it, not opposite from it, next to it, coterminously, I speak of slow futuring, which tends to be less immediate, less immediately observable, but nonetheless undergoing and with long-term effect, like an underground current that is shaping the relief from underneath in ways that are not immediately observable, but nonetheless shifting the terrain and shaping relief over a longer period of time. It has evolutionary long-term impact with longer processual and cumulative effects, while the first one is more a trend-setting outcome. If we accept that these are the trends, some of the questions that I would like to ask is, what kind of modes of learning and what kind of faculties and practices do we need to develop for both waves? How can we account for both of these waves for more expansive and more inclusive anticipation and the future it foresees? How can we account better for the relationship between these strong and slow futures? These ways of sensing and making sense consequently shape the attitudes we have to the self, the other, resources, and environment. So I understand them not as polarities, not as dichotomies or inversions. They are concurrent, interrelated, and mutually productive, and they engage different shades of anticipation modes on the spectrum from certainty to uncertainty. So from prediction to forecast, to foresight, to invention, and envisioning. So different anticipatory practices employ different relationships to and attitudes towards future. One senses the future as something in waiting, there to be decoded and prepared for, more of an event and an out there, engaged in a more reactive and corrective manner. The other senses the future as something in making, to be created and brought forth, more of an experience and an in here, engaged in more proactive, improvisational, transformative manner. For me, it is exactly in between, that is in the interstices of these anticipatory modes, that I situate the powerful potential generative space for unlocking the potential of the present, as David Snowden calls it. Lucky to have here today. So, as you can see in relationship to what we've discussed or what I mentioned at the beginning regarding the centers of power and those disenfranchised voices, you can see that there's somewhat of a polarizing movement between strong trend-setting powers or futuring and the slow futuring or futures and worlds that are made in the street, as I mentioned in the plenary session. So the next thing that I would like to ask is, what kind of individuality needs to be cultivated to envision, engender, and enact such transformation of consciousness required for an inclusive, equitable, sustainable, and peaceful shared global culture in the world? In other words, how can we act from the interstices and be conscious of the kind of perceptual complexity that we have to uphold to create those different futures, more desirable, should I say, and the question of who desires and all of that is implicated in it. So I ask, who and how are we being now to be the culture makers of the future, the modern day demiurges, except at this time we are rather cyborgs, as Donna Haraway would call us, because we are machines and humans, prosthetic beings, rather than these semi-gods of ancient times. So the modern day demiurge is willing to undergo transformation through which we develop new ways of being. Not only being, but also knowing and creating as boons for the whole and more wholesome human community. The notion of culture making is put forth here as a continual process of reinvention and reimagining from the perspective of sustainability of soil, soul, and society. It is a dynamic and participatory process in a set of interrelated configurations, such as cultural atmosphere, social movement, and systems of care and support. And world building is meant to invoke here the wider notion of Bildung from German literature and philosophy, meaning both production and innovation processes, as well as conscious emancipation, self-cultivation, and self-edifying through lifelong learning. So these modern culture makers and world builders are aware of Kairos, which is the ancient notion of the most opportune moment and the capacity to recognize the most opportune moment for change. And very often, as we have spoken before, crisis is exactly that tipping or turning point. And we have to be aware what it is, that kind of decision making that we're creating right now. The most opportune moment to go through this process with compassionate courage to undergo that change, and the passionate will to invent the momentous present for unlocking its evolutionary potential. Kairos involves both recognition of the most opportune moment for change or action, but it also denotes will to invent, which is inbuilt in us. With the question of what kind of individuals do we have to be, I would like to bring forth a notion of a theoretical biologist whose name is Jakob von Uexküll, who is the grandfather of the Jakob von Uexküll, the founder of World Future Council, who is considered the progenitor of biosemiotics. And his key notion was that we are all, and I mean all, life forms. And this breeds a particular respect for all life forms, and it should breed that respect in us. We're all readers of signs as we interact with the environment and with each other. So this is why I'm raising the question, what kind of literacy, what kind of education of the mind and soul and the body of a wholesome human being do we need to be more refined readers of the signs of the momentous present? I would like to mention here another notion of what I've called with quantum learning, a quantum shift for universal change, where the smallest shift on the deepest level can have large scale consequences on the scale of personal and psycho-emotional to collective and econo-political change. And if you don't trust me on that one, we just need to think about splitting the atom and what kind of effect it had, unfortunately, for the humanity. Another notion that I would like to mention here is being the readers of signs, we're also creators of signs and metaphors. And for that purpose, I would like to bring, which I mentioned yesterday, bring to your awareness the distinction between event and experience, that they cannot be collated, that there's an interstice in between those two that is extremely significant. That something happens, and what constitutes our experience of that which happens is our interpretation of the event. It's the story we tell ourselves of what has happened to us or another or to the world. So in between those two, there's a moment of translation and interpretation. And mind you, that is an aesthetic process of representation. And I find that very significant. Between the event and the experience is an aesthetic process, an act of representation, translation, sense-making, that is storytelling. This process then becomes part of personal and collective history, identity, way of knowing, relating, informative of the development of transferable knowledge, which in turn, via neuroplasticity, informs and shapes even our biology, even DNA. We now know that DNA is in part rewritable. So this is an aesthetic process of making sense of the sensory, sensual, and sensible, and sublimating that into even spiritual resource of higher guidance and knowledge, a transcendence of a certain kind. This is also a process of representation of values, of peoples and aspirations. It becomes carried over, translated into the domain of the political as the institutionalized process of representation. This is the deep driver of the process of unlocking and liberating the evolutionary potential. The capacity to imagine and imagine bigger and better will drive that which determines and regulates the conditions to see, understand, express, and imagine. The potential of the anticipatory thinking is then placed yet again at the interstices of the political and the aesthetic and how they relate. And this is where also is another tension, so to speak, as we know that we have established powers or constituted powers and constituting powers that are trying to gain a sense of participation in power and decision making. And that usually stems from the imagined, from the envisioned, from the aesthetic, from that which is also disenfranchised and whose only capacity and means of being represented might only be aesthetic. What is the representation? What is the actual representation of the Native Americans? It's predominantly aesthetic. What is the representation of the Gypsies? It's aesthetic. They have all left indelible marks on the politics of the U.S. Just one note. Say the Iroquois nations, on the Constitution of the U.S., or Gypsies have left, or the Roma, have left indelible mark on so many cultures that it's a whole other discussion. What is their representation is reduced to aesthetic, nonetheless it's all pervasive. So the anticipatory thinking in terms of who can become hopefully the next partner in power, not just a participant, I'm hoping for partnership in power, is going to be determined at the interstices between the political and the aesthetic. But ultimately, they all funnel into the question of representation, narrativization, and storytelling. So this kind of just gives you an idea of how I have structured things where I'm proposing different ways of futuring and think about how they're bound in relational dynamics. Then I speak about the event and experience as this process of translation and narrativization to drive it to the question of representation, to ultimately go back to the topic, to the very title of who can imagine and bring about change in the realm through or via representation and in terms of culture making and world building. So every structure built, every technology is ideologically informed and imbued. And we as creatures of techne, of both nature and cultures. If that is so, then the way to access ourselves and the future structures would be from the understanding of the ideology that motivates them, devising strategies and approaches of transforming the ideology for future building It is having the capacity to approach it with double vision, from the macro perspective, the broadest perspective of culture setting, systems of belief, while simultaneously devising precise strategies, means informed by that transformative understanding to enact change. Bringing the change from within by rearranging desires, as Gayatri Spivak called it. Rearranging the desires is what we consume, how we view nature, ourselves, each other, how we spend our money, what is the worth of our money, of our time, what is it that we recognize as value, and that is that which determines the price of everything. In this sense, it is also giving back to people a sense of worthiness and dignity as participators and partners, so that they can determine better values, so that they can decide what a sense of well-being constitutes for each and for all of us. As we are focused only on creating the technological means of fixing the planetary problems, reordering things and changing the course of the multifaceted crisis, these solutions usually mean salvaging things, meaning damage control, from where we are merely managing a pattern of continually creating conditions for the next stage of and need for fix-ups and always another glitch. Any technological solution becomes a precondition of another problem, self-perpetuating mechanism. Solutions to sustain us long-term are those that will rearrange a multitude of relationships between phenomena, each other, environment, the change in consciousness and conscientiousness. We are intent on generating these solutions for something that is essentially requiring a change in desire, worldview, attitude, stories that will inform a more comprehensive, inclusive, conscious set of actions. If we don't address the worldview, values of the greater humanity from their standpoint, context-bound standpoint, we will be offering our technological solutions and offering trinkets, gadgets, kits for repair, improvement, and edifices that ultimately can be blown up.